The papers were signed before dawn, the kind of quiet that carries both relief and exhaustion. I stood by the window, watching the street empty except for the occasional passing headlights, and felt the weight of absence settle around me. He had left with everything he could physically claim: the car that had once been ours, the furniture we had chosen together, the paintings he liked and the ones he didn't. Even the rug I had spent hours searching for, the one that warmed the living room, had been packed into boxes and loaded onto a truck. I could hear the faint hum of the engine as it faded into the distance, and with it went the illusion of control, the final punctuation on years of shared history. But in that stillness, a strange clarity began to take shape. He had thought he was taking the house, the accounts, the possessions that could be counted, measured, and legally documented. He had assumed that these things were the measure of my life, the proof of what mattered, the markers of what I valued. And yes, he had carried away many of the things that had been visible, tangible, and marketable, the ones the world recognizes as wealth or success. But I realized, with a quiet shock, that he had not touched the foundation of me. He had left untouched the years I had spent learning to endure, the habits I had formed to keep my heart steady through disappointment, and the small pleasures I had collected in silence, tucked away in drawers, notebooks, and memory. The most valuable parts of my life had never been his to take. I wandered through the rooms we had shared, each one echoing with the faint imprint of what had been and what had passed unnoticed. The living room, now empty, seemed larger than I remembered, a space waiting to be repopulated with intention rather than obligation. The kitchen, stripped of the dishes and utensils he preferred, held the faint aroma of coffee I brewed each morning for myself, a small ritual of self-recognition I had performed without thought of anyone else. I traced my fingers along the counter where sunlight spilled in through the window, and I felt an unfamiliar lightness, a sense that even though he had taken the visible, he had overlooked the invisible wealth I had cultivated quietly over decades. I began to notice the things he could never claim: the notebooks where I had poured my thoughts, sketches and doodles that mapped my own growth, letters I had written but never sent, photographs of moments that mattered only to me. Each object, each memory, became a subtle act of reclamation. He believed he had removed me from the narrative, but the truth was that the narrative existed within me, independently of his awareness or permission. The house, the accounts, the furniture, they were remnants of a shared past, but they were not the essence of the life I had built. I had invested in endurance, in patience, in the quiet accumulation of self-respect, and those investments were impervious to his claims. The emptiness of the house carried its own voice. I could hear the faint creak of the floorboards under my feet, the whisper of the wind against the windows, the soft hum of the heater in the corner. Each sound was a reminder that life continued, that the rhythm of existence was not dependent on the possessions he had taken or the approval he assumed was necessary. I moved through the room slowly, deliberately, noticing the way light fell across surfaces, the way shadows shifted with the morning sun. It was a lesson in observation, in presence, in the understanding that the most meaningful aspects of life are often intangible, imperceptible to those who prioritize ownership over essence. I thought about the years we had spent together, the compromises we had made, the moments when I had deferred my own desires for the sake of harmony. He had assumed that the tangible markers of our life, bank accounts, property, possessions, were the sum total of value. And in doing so, he overlooked the resilience I had cultivated, the independence I had fostered, the subtle strength that had allowed me to navigate disappointment without collapse. He had never understood that love, patience, endurance, and self-reliance are not things one can seize through legal process or physical removal. They are lived, quietly, invisibly, and they grow precisely in the spaces where expectation and control are absent. I found myself in the bedroom, standing before the empty closet where his clothes had hung, and my own had once shared space in a quiet equilibrium. I ran my hand along the empty rods, imagining the weight of each garment, the absence of him, and the presence of me. I realized that in all those years, I had constructed an inner landscape he could never access. He had assumed mastery over what was visible, but he could not perceive the internal architecture of my life, the coping mechanisms, the self-directed routines, the quiet joys I had cultivated in hours of solitude. He had taken the visible, but the invisible was mine alone, and in it lay a profound freedom he never anticipated. I moved through the house like a careful surveyor, cataloging what remained and what had been lost, not with bitterness, but with a growing awareness of what truly mattered. I found old journals tucked behind bookshelves, filled with reflections, sketches, and notes that chronicled my own growth, resilience, and moments of beauty. I discovered letters I had written but never sent, words that mapped my emotional journey, revealing strengths I had not fully acknowledged. I saw photographs of landscapes, friends, and travels that reminded me I had cultivated joy and wonder even in the absence of shared recognition. Each of these items became a symbol of survival, a quiet testament to the fact that life continues and value exists beyond what can be taken or measured. The more I wandered, the more I recognized a pattern I had overlooked while immersed in the negotiation of shared life. The things he prized, furniture, money, assets, trophies of appearance and achievement, were in truth external. They represented security in a world of perception, but they were not the measure of me. The core of my life, the steady pulse of endurance, the subtle rhythms of self-care, the small pleasures of observation and reflection were impervious to his legal triumph. For the first time, I understood that true wealth is not something that can be owned, seized, or transferred. It is cultivated, internalized, and carried silently, unrecognized by those who measure only the material. I sat in the empty living room and let myself breathe, fully, without expectation, without judgment. The quiet was unfamiliar, yet comforting, a reminder that even in the absence of the familiar, life offers space to inhabit oneself fully. I traced my fingers along the windowsill once more, feeling the grooves worn by time, each mark a testament to life lived and observed. I realized that I had survived, and more than that, I had grown. The divorce had removed the tangible, but it had also clarified what was essential. I possessed the inner landscape of courage, patience, and self-possession that no court could quantify and no adversary could seize. He believed he was taking everything of value, but the most significant aspects of my life had always been intangible. My habits, my memories, my quiet joys, my resilience, these were impervious to judgment, to separation, to legal decree. In the absence of confrontation or drama, I began to sense the depth of my own resources, the quiet fortitude that had carried me through disappointment and disillusionment. I felt for the first time in a long time a profound recognition that what truly matters cannot be seized, borrowed, or transferred. As the morning light shifted across the empty rooms, I saw that the divorce had stripped away more than material possessions. It had removed the scaffolding of shared expectation, the subtle pressures and the quiet compromises that had kept me tethered to another sense of worth. Now, in the emptiness, I found not loss but possibility. The visible was gone, but the invisible, the essence, the quiet mastery, the self-directed rhythm of life remained, intact and mine to cultivate. I could inhabit these spaces freely, shaping life according to my own intention, rather than reacting to someone else's claims or assumptions. The awareness settled over me like the soft light of dawn. He had taken much, but not everything. The most significant aspects of my life, the ones that sustain us, give meaning, and allow growth, had been nurtured quietly, invisibly, over years of reflection and endurance. They existed within me, unclaimed and untouchable, waiting to be honored, explored, and expanded. I realized that my freedom, resilience, and capacity for joy were not contingent on possession or legal recognition, but on awareness, attention, and deliberate choice. I stood at the window, watching the street awaken, feeling the subtle pulse of life continuing around me. The absence of tangible possessions did not diminish the presence of self, nor did it reduce the capacity for quiet strength and clarity. I understood that in the years I had spent cultivating patience, observing life, and building a sense of agency, I had created something that no divorce, no legal decree, or no adversary could ever take away. The first morning after he left, I woke before the sun, the silence of the house unfamiliar, yet oddly gentle. I moved slowly, noticing the small details that had been overshadowed by years of shared life. The faint scent of the rain on the window pane, the way the light spilled across the wooden floor, the quiet hum of the refrigerator that had always been background noise. It struck me then that freedom is not always loud or triumphant. Sometimes it comes softly, in the absence of someone else's presence, in the space between the clamor of expectation and the stillness of observation. I went to the kitchen and brewed a cup of coffee, letting the aroma fill the empty space. I sat at the table, noticing the steam curling into the morning air, and I realized I had never fully appreciated the act of making coffee for myself alone. It was mundane, ordinary, but suddenly it was also profoundly personal. The cup in my hands felt heavier with intention, lighter with absence, and I understood that autonomy is composed of these quiet, ordinary moments. He could not touch this. He could not claim this simple ritual as part of his triumph, because it was mine alone, a small but unassailable piece of my life. As the day unfolded, I began exploring corners of the house I had overlooked while living in the shared rhythm of marriage. Drawers I had never opened revealed notebooks filled with sketches, grocery lists that charted my independent decision-making, letters I had written and never sent. Each item was a reminder that life continues in layers unseen, that even in the presence of another, one cultivates aspects of self that are inviolable, protected by nothing but awareness and care. I could see now that he had mistaken possession for power, failing to recognize the quiet architecture of autonomy that had grown beneath the surface of our shared existence. I found an old journal tucked behind the row of books, its spine worn and soft from years of handling. I opened it and began reading, and with each page I felt a surge of awareness that he had no access to. Here were the plans I had sketched, the reflections I had written in moments of doubt and fear, the dreams I had whispered into the night when the house was dark and still. He had assumed that the absence of confrontation equaled absence of depth, that silence was weakness. But in these pages, my strength was cataloged, my resilience quietly documented, my imagination and reflection unbroken. Walking through the empty rooms, I noticed the spaces that had been shaped by my choices, where I had hung photographs, arranged books, and left little tokens of memory tucked on shelves. He had assumed that by taking the physical markers of life, he had claimed victory, but he had overlooked the intangible imprint of presence, the subtle cultivation of a life that thrives on awareness and intention rather than ownership. I felt a rising sense of liberation, an understanding that autonomy is built not in confrontation, but in the careful attention to one's own rhythms, values, and joys. I spent hours moving through the house slowly, deliberately, allowing myself to feel the absence of the tangible and the presence of the intangible. The bedroom, once shared, now felt expansive and empty, yet comforting. I noticed the way light reflected off the walls, the gentle hum of the heater, the subtle creak of the floor beneath my feet. These small, almost imperceptible details became markers of my independence, proof that I could inhabit the world fully without reliance on another. He could take what could be measured, but he could not touch the quiet confidence that had been forged through years of introspection and perseverance. I opened the drawers of the desk and found letters I had written to myself, notes of encouragement in moments of fatigue or frustration, reflections on dreams deferred and fulfilled. Each line reminded me that autonomy is not the absence of connection, but the presence of a relationship with oneself. He had assumed that by walking away with material possessions, he had diminished my life. But the truth was that the architecture of my inner world remained intact, resilient, and untouchable. This realization brought a subtle warmth, a quiet sense of triumph that did not depend on him, on validation, or on recognition. Evenings became exercises in small pleasures. I cooked a simple meal, tasting each flavor with attention I had never allowed myself before. I played music I loved without compromise, letting it fill the rooms and my own lungs. I walked through the neighborhood alone, noticing the way the wind caught the branches of trees, the distant laughter of children in yards, the subtle rhythm of a world moving forward independently of his choices. These routines were unclaimed treasures, small acts of self-possession that existed beyond the reach of his assumptions, beyond the grasp of legal documents or physical removal. I began to recognize the power in what he could not take. He had carried away the visible, the tangible, the documented, but he could not claim the quiet joy of a morning cup of coffee made in solitude, the satisfaction of reclaiming my own routines,
the depth of reflection captured in notebooks no one else would ever read. Each act of observation, each quiet ritual, became a reaffirmation of autonomy, a subtle reclaiming of life's rhythm that was entirely my own. I realized that these invisible aspects of self, cultivated over decades, are not only resilient but transformative, offering sustenance in ways material possessions never could. There were moments when doubt crept in, moments when I wondered if he truly understood the value of what he had assumed he had taken. But each time I returned to the quiet corners of the home, to the spaces of memory and reflection, and felt a steadying sense of strength. Autonomy, I realized, is not loud or boastful. It is quiet, consistent, and enduring. It resides in small choices, in the attention to life as it is, in the cultivation of habits that honor the self. He had overlooked this, assuming that life's measure was visible and transferable, and in that assumption lay his own blindness. I began journaling again, writing letters to no one, recording thoughts that had been waiting for space and attention. The act itself was liberating, a reaffirmation that my life belonged to me. He had taken objects, contracts, and accounts, but he could not take the narrative I had written for myself, nor could he diminish the memories, rituals, and personal growth that defined me. I found joy in rediscovery, of forgotten sketches, old photographs, and simple acts I had long taken for granted. Each rediscovery was a small celebration, a quiet acknowledgement that I had not only survived, but had cultivated a richness invisible to the world. As days passed, the sense of inner freedom grew. The absence of his presence was no longer a void, but a space of potential, a room in which my intentions could take shape without compromise. I rearranged furniture according to my own preference, placed books where they felt right, left photographs that mattered to me in prominent spots, and allowed the light to fall where it pleased. These were small, deliberate acts of self-assertion, gestures of reclamation that reminded me of the sovereignty I had always possessed but often deferred. He had assumed mastery over the material, but the true architecture of my life was far more enduring, built on intention, observation, and choice. I realized that autonomy is not achieved in moments of confrontation, but in the consistent, quiet assertion of self across time. Each act, whether making a cup of coffee, opening a journal, or choosing to enjoy a morning walk, became a subtle yet profound act of empowerment. He could not take these moments, could not diminish the value embedded in routine, reflection, and observation. The more I noticed them, the more I understood the depth of what remained entirely mine. A life lived intentionally, a self acknowledged and attended to, a quiet but unassailable autonomy. In the weeks that followed, I came to understand the richness of what he could not claim. The divorce had removed many things from my life, yet in the space it created, I discovered freedoms previously unnoticed. The freedom to choose, to reflect, to savor ordinary moments without obligation or compromise. The house, stripped of its possessions, became a canvas for my life lived according to my own terms. And in that recognition, I felt a quiet triumph that no legal decree could confer, no possession could signify, no adversary could diminish.
The days after he left were quieter than I had expected. Not the dramatic silence of a storm passing, but a gentle, persistent calm that seemed to seep into every corner of the house. I noticed it first in the mornings, when the light touched the walls in ways I hadn't seen before, revealing the texture of paint, the subtle grain of the wood beneath the furniture. It was as if the absence of his presence allowed the house to exhale, to settle into its own rhythm, and in that rhythm, I began to notice the rhythms of my own body and mind. I realized that I had been living in a constant negotiation with another person's expectations, that my movements, my thoughts, even my breathing had been subtly shaped by his presence. Now, alone, I could attend fully to myself, and it felt both foreign and familiar, as though I were reclaiming a part of life I had never allowed myself to inhabit fully. I walked through the room slowly, letting my hands brush along surfaces I had long taken for granted. The windowsills, the kitchen counter, the backs of chairs. They were ordinary, mundane, yet they carried a weight I hadn't recognized. They held the memory of years, of decisions made silently, compromises accepted without complaint, moments of quiet endurance. He had believed that by taking the visible, the measurable, he had taken the essence of life. But in truth, the essence existed in the subtleties, in the choices made when no one else was watching, in the quiet attention to the world and to oneself. The house, stripped of his belongings, became a mirror, reflecting the inner landscape I had cultivated in secret. I sat in the living room with a cup of tea, noticing the way the steam spiraled upward, dissipating slowly into the morning light. I thought about the years I had spent investing in him, in us, in the appearance of partnership rather than the reality of selfhood. He had taken what was easily counted, easily measured, but he had overlooked the quiet accumulation of strength, resilience, and understanding that could not be quantified. I realized that the divorce, while painful, had illuminated a truth I had only glimpsed in moments of solitude. The most important parts of life are invisible, nurtured quietly, often overlooked, yet unassailable. I began to revisit the personal archives I had kept tucked away. Journals, sketchbooks, letters, photographs that chronicled the life I had lived alongside, yet often separate from him. Each item carried a story that he could not touch, could not influence, could not claim. In these pages and images, I saw a self that had persisted despite disappointment, that had celebrated small victories in silence, that had cultivated joy without seeking recognition. It became clear that while he had taken the external markers of our shared life, he had left untouched the inner architecture I had built over decades. The realization deepened as I began to engage with the house differently, no longer as a shared space, but as a territory of self-possession. I rearranged furniture, placing items where they felt right to me rather than where he preferred them. I hung photographs on the walls according to my own sense of narrative, not to complement his aesthetic, and I left spaces intentionally open, allowing light to define the rooms rather than furniture. Each deliberate act reinforced a subtle yet profound truth. Autonomy is not granted, it is cultivated, nurtured, and exercised, often in the smallest and quietest details of daily life. He could remove the tangible, but he could not remove the decisions I made about how I inhabited my own space. I found solace in the routines I had neglected while negotiating shared life. Cooking became an act of presence, each ingredient measured not according to shared taste, but according to my own intuition. The way the knife moved through vegetables, the aroma of herbs and spices mingling with the warmth of the oven, became a meditation in motion. I realized that these small, repeated actions were more than survival. They were a reclamation of rhythm, a tangible expression of autonomy that could not be taken, that existed independently of anyone else's influence. Even washing dishes became a quiet ceremony, a reminder that the mundane can be sacred when performed with attention and care. As I moved through the house, I noticed subtle shifts in my body and mind. My posture straightened in the absence of unconscious accommodation to his preferences. My gaze lingered on details I had overlooked before, the way light reflected off the glass, the slight sway of curtains in the morning breeze, the way the floor creaked softly underfoot. These details became markers of presence, reminders that life exists in observation, in attention, and that what is observed fully cannot be diminished by absence or loss. He had assumed that his departure diminished my experience, but in truth, it allowed me to inhabit it more fully, more consciously, more wholly. I began to think about the habits I had cultivated over the years, the small practices of care and reflection that had gone unnoticed while life demanded performance and compromise. I revisited old sketches, noting the evolution of my hand and eye over time, and I read letters I had written to myself, letters that chronicled moments of fear, hope, frustration, and triumph. Each page reminded me that identity is not formed through approval or ownership, but through attention, reflection, and the sustained practice of self-engagement. He could claim material objects, but he could not claim the narrative of selfhood, the quiet testimony of resilience and growth documented in these private archives. I began to walk through the neighborhood alone, feeling the rhythm of the city and its inhabitants, noticing patterns that had previously escaped me.
The laughter of children playing in yards, the distant hum of traffic, the flutter of birds in the trees. All of these small details became part of a tapestry that I had the privilege to observe without distraction or compromise. The awareness was liberating, not because it was dramatic, but because it was ordinary, persistent, and wholly mine. Observation became a form of autonomy, and the act of noticing became a declaration of presence and self-possession. Evenings became a time of quiet ritual. I lit candles on the table, brewed tea, and allowed myself to linger in the spaces of the home without urgency or obligation. Music filled the rooms according to my preferences, and I let my attention drift without guilt or self-criticism. I noticed that the absence of his interference allowed me to inhabit these moments fully, to savor them, and to recognize that autonomy is both the freedom to choose and the space to simply exist, unclaimed and untethered. He had thought that possession equaled power, but in these simple, persistent routines, I realized that true power lies in presence, attention, and the cultivation of a life lived intentionally. I returned to the journals and letters, reading them slowly, allowing myself to feel the full weight of the experiences recorded there. I reflected on the ways I had endured, adapted, and grown without recognition, and I felt a quiet pride, a steady warmth that was entirely independent of his presence or approval. The divorce had removed tangible markers, but it had also created a space in which self-awareness could flourish, in which autonomy could be practiced deliberately, and in which the invisible aspects of life, the reflection, the observation, the quiet cultivation of joy could be fully appreciated. I realized that the divorce, while painful, had illuminated a truth I had overlooked. Life is not measured by possessions, victories, or control, but by the quiet accumulation of resilience, presence, and self-directed attention. He could leave with everything he could carry, but the most valuable aspects of life, the habits, reflections, and choices that define a person, remained untouched. They were mine, cultivated over decades, invisible to those who value only the tangible, yet sustaining, protective, and enduring beyond measure. In the days that followed, I noticed subtle shifts in how I moved through the house, how I interacted with the world, how I perceived my own life. The absence of his presence was no longer a void, but a space filled with attention, care, and reflection. I began to see that autonomy is not a single act of separation, but a continuous practice of noticing, choosing, and inhabiting life fully. Each morning coffee, each walk, each journal entry, each quiet observation became a testament to the fact that what truly matters cannot be removed, cannot be claimed, and cannot be diminished by absence or departure.
The first time I went out after the separation, I felt the weight of being unanchored, like stepping onto a bridge suspended over fog. The streets were familiar, yet every corner held new possibilities, unclaimed by expectation or obligation. I realized that freedom is not always a flood of triumph. Sometimes it is a quiet tremor, a subtle reshaping of perception, a soft awareness that the world continues whether or not anyone else approves or participates. I walked slowly, noticing the texture of the pavement beneath my feet, the distant hum of traffic, the way the early morning light fractured through branches, painting patterns on the sidewalk that no one else would witness in the same way. In this solitary awareness, I began to recognize the contours of my own independence, fragile yet undeniable. I stopped at a small cafe I had passed 100 times but never entered alone. Inside, the aroma of fresh bread and coffee grounded me, and I realized I could exist in a space for myself without the need for permission. The barista smiled, and I returned the gesture with ease, noticing the way small human interactions, unmediated by history or obligation, could feel restorative. I ordered a simple cup of tea, watching the steam curl in slow, hypnotic patterns, and I felt the first flush of a feeling I had long neglected: self-possession. It was not loud, not dramatic, but persistent, an undercurrent that strengthened with each quiet observation and deliberate choice. Walking back through the neighborhood, I began to notice the patterns of my own life that had been overshadowed by his presence. I remembered errands run without thought,
mornings filled with preparation for his needs, evenings consumed with the performance of companionship rather than the cultivation of self. Now, each step, each breath, each gesture was mine alone, and in that realization, I felt a deep, steadying relief. Autonomy is subtle, often invisible, yet it reshapes perception. I could feel the tension of decades easing, a soft release that came not from confrontation but from recognition of what had always existed quietly within me, waiting for the space to be noticed and honored. At home, I opened the drawers of my desk, long neglected under the weight of shared life. I discovered sketches, letters, and photographs I had forgotten I owned. Each page was a reminder that identity exists independently of legal documents, possessions, or external validation. He had believed that taking material things equaled taking life, but these archives, private and resilient, reminded me that true life is preserved in attention, memory, and quiet acts of reflection. I spent hours sifting through them, feeling the texture of paper, the sweep of ink, the imprint of memory pressed into the fibers of each page. In these tactile reminders, I recognized the layers of myself that could not be seized, cannot be erased, cannot be diminished by absence or loss. Evenings became exercises in presence. I brewed tea and let the aroma fill the rooms, lit candles and allowed the shadows to fall where they pleased. I played music I loved, not compromised for anyone else, and I let the notes echo through empty halls. The rooms, once shared and negotiated, now belonged entirely to me, and in their stillness I began to hear the rhythm of my own life, unmediated by expectation or history. I noticed how simple acts, washing dishes, arranging furniture, moving through space, could become profound exercises in autonomy. Each choice, no matter how small, was a declaration of presence, a quiet assertion of selfhood that no legal settlement or physical removal could touch. I began journaling again, letting thoughts spill onto paper without restraint or judgment. I reflected on years of compromise, of tending to needs that were not my own, of negotiating a life that had always required invisible labor. And I realized that the most powerful reclamation does not come from resistance, but from deliberate attention to what is inherently yours. Each word I wrote became a small act of sovereignty, a confirmation that the story of life is authored in private moments as much as in public gestures. Autonomy is not performed for spectacle. It is practiced quietly, consistently, in the accumulation of decisions that honor the self. I started noticing how deeply habits and routines define life beyond what is visible. Making breakfast, walking to the park, reading for pleasure, all ordinary acts became extraordinary because they were no longer negotiated, no longer performed in deference to another. I began to catalog these moments in my mind, observing how they stitched together into a tapestry of intentional existence. He had assumed that taking what he could measure was the equivalent of control, but the invisible architecture of life, composed of mindfulness and reflection, remained untouched, resilient, and sustaining. I ventured further from home, walking through quiet streets and parks, observing the lives around me without judgment. Children played, couples moved in rhythm, dogs bounded with joy, strangers smiled in passing. I realized that life continues, indifferent to expectation or approval, and in this observation, I found a subtle, enduring freedom. Autonomy is not merely physical, it is perceptual, a deliberate engagement with the world that affirms presence and agency. I understood that he could take objects, possessions, and markers of life, but he could not take the awareness, attention, or quiet delight that defines how one inhabits existence fully. Returning home one evening, I noticed a small envelope slipped under the door. It was a note from my mother, a tentative olive branch, expressing concern and suggesting reconciliation. For a moment, I felt the pull of habit, the memory of past dependence, the old narrative that had tied my identity to appeasing others. But as I held the note, I realized that reconciliation could not be built on obligation, guilt, or performance. True connection requires mutual respect and acknowledgement, not coercion or expectation. I tucked the note aside, not with anger, but with awareness, recognizing that presence and boundaries could coexist, and that my life could be rich and full even without compliance to the old scripts that had constrained me. The physical spaces I once shared began to reflect a psychological shift unfolding within me. I rearranged furniture, leaving light and air to guide placements rather than habit or routine. I hung photographs on walls where I wished, curated objects that brought joy rather than obligation. Even the act of walking through the house became an affirmation of intention. He had assumed that ownership equals control, but control is an illusion. The true measure of life lies in deliberate, attentive inhabitation of time and space, and this could not be seized by force, court decree, or absence. I spent hours alone, sitting with my thoughts and memories, letting emotions wash over me without suppression. Sadness came, anger appeared, but so did curiosity and wonder. I realized that autonomy is not an absence of emotion. It is the ability to feel fully, to witness life as it unfolds, and to act in alignment with one's values and priorities. The divorce had removed tangible structures, but it had created the conditions for deep, uninterrupted reflection. In this solitude, I discovered resilience I had taken for granted, a quiet strength that had existed beneath years of negotiation, compromise, and invisible labor. The rituals of daily life became acts of quiet reclamation. Brewing tea, tending to the garden, arranging books, walking in the morning light, all simple tasks became exercises in autonomy. Each act a deliberate acknowledgement that life is experienced through attention, not ownership. I noticed a change in my body as well, the way I moved with more ease, how posture shifted when tension no longer weighed me down, how each breath could be noticed and claimed rather than unconsciously surrendered to the needs of another. He had taken what was tangible, measurable, and immediate, but the invisible scaffolding of presence, awareness, and deliberate choice remained untouchable. Even mundane interactions took on new meaning. Smiling at a neighbor, greeting the mail carrier, listening to a friend without distraction, all became expressions of unmediated engagements, moments that affirmed presence without compromise. I realized that autonomy is not an act of isolation, it is the conscious participation in life, experienced fully and deliberately. Each interaction, each observation, each simple ritual reinforced the understanding that true life cannot be stolen or diminished. It can only be ignored, and choosing to notice it is an act of reclamation.
In the weeks after the divorce, I began to notice the small ways the world adjusted to my present, as if the rhythm of life had subtly shifted to accommodate a self I had long neglected. Mornings became a quiet sanctuary, each sunrise an invitation to inhabit time fully, rather than as a backdrop to someone else's priorities. I lingered over coffee, feeling the warmth seep into my hands, the steam curling upward in slow, deliberate spirals. In these simple rituals, I recognized an unfamiliar freedom, a subtle authority over my own experience that had never required validation or negotiation. He had taken the tangible, the measurable, but the intangible, presence, attention, self-possession, remained untouched, flourishing quietly into spaces he had assumed would be empty. I began to move through my home with deliberate awareness, noticing corners long ignored, surfaces neglected, objects whose significance I had deferred to shared preference. I dusted shelves and polished furniture, not out of obligation, but out of recognition that care for one's environment is also care for oneself. The act was meditative, almost sacred, each motion a quiet assertion of autonomy. He had believed that material possession equaled power, yet I discovered that true power resides in attentiveness, in shaping one's world with intention rather than demand. Every gesture, every small choice became an unspoken reclamation of life lived fully on my own terms. Even the air felt different. Without the constant negotiation of presence and expectation, I noticed the rhythm of my own breathing, the subtle patterns of thought that had been interrupted for years. Each inhalation and exhalation was unobserved, uninterrupted, mine entirely. The ordinary, unnoticed acts of living became profound markers of selfhood. I realized that he had measured life in possessions, in victories that could be tallied, yet the most enduring aspects, the quiet persistence of thought, the cultivation of resilience, the nuanced appreciation of small beauty, could not be seized, could not be quantified, and could not be diminished. I explored the neighborhood on foot, letting the world unfold around me with a sense of curiosity I had long suppressed. Children played, dogs bounded, and the laughter of strangers drifted past, carrying with it a sense of vitality and continuity I had rarely allowed myself to notice. Each step became a quiet assertion of autonomy, a claim that my presence mattered simply because I inhabited it fully.
He had assumed that taking the visible would dictate the unseen, but life's subtleties, moments of reflection, acts of presence, the ability to notice and be moved, remained beyond his grasp, resilient and enduring. Evenings became a space for deliberate ritual, a time to anchor myself in the tangible comfort of quiet, solitary practice. I brewed tea and let the aroma permeate the air, played music that resonated with my own memories and emotions, and lingered in the soft illumination of lamps rather than overhead lights. These practices were not performative. They were exercises in reclaiming life from habit and expectation. He had imagined that removing objects, altering routines, or enforcing legal decisions would dismantle my life. But the essence of life, attention, presence, and care for oneself, cannot be taken, only ignored, and I was no longer willing to ignore it. I revisited personal projects I had abandoned over the years, sketches and writings hidden in drawers, fragments of thought preserved through time. I spent hours with them, tracing the evolution of my hand, the nuances of expression, the accumulation of reflection. Each discovery was a reminder that life, invested quietly, carries a richness no one else can claim. He had believed that success and fulfillment could be stripped away with the removal of possessions or titles. Yet the subtler triumphs, the ones lived internally, quietly, without fanfare, remained untouchable, unshaken, and profoundly sustaining. In solitude, I began to articulate a narrative of self that had been overshadowed by shared history. I noticed how much of life had been allocated to negotiating another's desires, smoothing conflicts, or performing relational duties that were invisible but exhausting. Each day I allowed myself to act in alignment with my own priorities became a reaffirmation of autonomy, a deliberate statement that life, even ordinary life, is worth inhabiting fully. The divorce had taken much of the external structure, yet it had also created a space for unmediated self-expression, and I found the quiet exhilaration of realizing that life need not be dictated by external expectations to be rich, meaningful, and satisfying. The mornings became longer, not in hours, but in awareness. I lingered over breakfast, walked slowly to parks, watched the interplay of sunlight and shadow, and listened to the unspoken rhythms of daily life. In this awareness, I discovered resilience I had long overlooked, the capacity to endure, to adapt, to cultivate joy without reliance on others. He had taken the property, the bank accounts, the legal rights, but he could not take the subtle accumulation of inner life, the scaffolding of identity built over decades. This realization was both quiet and powerful, a confirmation that autonomy is not granted, it is practiced, quietly, persistently, through attention, reflection, and deliberate engagement with the world. Even small domestic acts became symbols of reclamation. Cooking, cleaning, organizing, and walking through the home were performed with a mindfulness that I had rarely allowed myself before. Each act was a rehearsal in independence, a reminder that life is sustained not only by external structures, but by the choices one makes moment by moment. He had believed that removing material markers equaled erasing identity. Yet identity is preserved, nurtured, and strengthened in the repetition of conscious, deliberate acts that affirm presence and agency. I reconnected with old friends, not out of obligation, but out of desire, choosing conversations that nourished rather than drained. I discovered that connection is most sustaining when chosen freely, without coercion or guilt. Each dialogue, each visit became a reflection of self-possession, an affirmation that life is richest when engaged deliberately rather than out of necessity. He had assumed that absence or loss would diminish social ties, yet what remained, the friendships built on shared respect and voluntary attention, flourished in ways that he could not influence. I also explored creative expression once more. Sketching, writing, even small craft projects became avenues of sustained presence, ways to anchor thought and emotion in the world. I realized that creation, like autonomy, cannot be taken. It exists wherever it is nurtured. He had taken the visible and measurable, but he could not access the internal processes that sustained growth, insight, and fulfillment. These acts became rituals of reclamation, subtle yet powerful, reinforcing the understanding that life is not determined by possession, control, or legal authority, but by deliberate attention and intentional inhabitation. There were moments of quiet reflection where I recognized the depth of what had been lost, not in material terms, but in time, attention, and energy. Yet these reflections were tempered by the knowledge that the most enduring aspects of self, cultivated through decades of thought, observation, and quiet endurance, remained unassailable. He had believed that taking everything equaled dominance, yet the invisible architecture of life, presence, awareness, resilience, and choice, remained, supporting me in ways he could never comprehend. As the weeks passed, I noticed a subtle transformation in perception. Life became less about scarcity, about negotiation, about measurement, and more about observation, attention, and choice. I moved through space with a sense of rhythm, noticing patterns and subtleties, feeling a freedom that was ordinary, continuous, and profound. He had assumed that the absence of control would render me diminished, but autonomy does not demand recognition. It exists in the quiet accumulation of deliberate acts, in the attention paid to the mundane, in the cultivation of a life inhabited fully and attentively. I began to imagine the future differently, not constrained by past habits or imposed narratives. Each decision, from the placement of furniture to the choice of daily routines, became a microcosm of agency. I understood that life unfolds in small, persistent choices, each shaping perception and experience more than any legal document or possession ever could. He had taken what he could measure, yet the richness of life is preserved in attention, presence, and the cultivation of small joys, and these could not be seized, only recognized by the one living them.